thank you for being here today. Marc Lowenstein, all of you know his work and his writings, especially about advising his teaching, and he's been a Stockton institution. And we're sorry to see him go in June. And I personally have felt like he's been one of my big mentors at Stockton, and I'm sure in many ways he's been that to you too. So we just want to welcome Marc and thank you for doing your presentation for us today.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you all for coming and for finding your way up to this room. It's a very nice place that commemorates terrible events, which is a little bit off-putting, perhaps. But we also thank the Holocaust Resource Center for the loan of the space. I want to call your attention right away to the document that was handed out. This is a very, very interesting document that dates to the founding of Stockton in 1970, 71, thereabouts. It is unsigned and undated, but it is fairly reasonable to assume, based on what it says, that it's the work of our first academic vice president, Wes Tilley, who was an incredible visionary and responsible for a lot of the things about Stockton that are either revolutionary or kooky, depending on your point of view, or possibly both. And one of the things that he designed that is either revolutionary or kooky is the preceptorial system, many features of which did not survive the first year of the college, including a number of things that he refers to in this document. But in a lot of ways, I find this to be incredibly foresightful, that it describes a role for the preceptor that preceptors, quite frankly, at Stockton, in my experience, have almost never really had. But that is a pretty neat ideal for us all to look up to. Was then, I think Wes thought it was actually going to happen, and perhaps in the first year it did. But I'm going to call your attention to a few features of this as a way of leading into talking about an ideal of what preceptorial advising can be at Stockton. Those of you who are Stockton people know that we call it precepting here. It's called advising most other places. Some places it's still called counseling. And I'm going to say something about that too. I want to apologize on Wes Tilley's behalf for his non-gender neutral language, which you may already have noticed if you've started reading it. It was 1970 and it was just starting to happen. So you have to get past that. And I beg you to forgive him. Stockton had a very unstructured general education curriculum in the early years. General studies was there, but there were no distribution requirements within general studies. Distribution requirements were first introduced in 1978, 7 years in. I think Tom's coming must have had something to do with that, because, yeah, I'm kidding. Yeah. So for a student to make rational choices among the general studies offerings, or sane choices among the general studies offerings, or rather, as we still wish they would, make choices based on something other than what time of day the course is offered and whether it's consistent with when they want to get up and when they want to go to work, some kind of help is needed. So I think that from reading this document, and I'm going to call your attention to a few things in it, but I urge you to read the whole thing later on, because it's just so interesting. But I believe that Wes Tilley saw the need for someone to help students make those choices intentionally, to use a word that he does not use and that was not in currency at that time. It wasn't a common word found in higher education literature then as it is now. Students needed to make intentional choices, and they needed help in doing that. They were coming, as he mentions, from typically much more structured environments where most choices were made for them, and now they were going to need to make free choices, and they needed help. And they needed to make those choices intentionally, and that's what the preceptor was for. The preceptor was not simply to approve your course choices, and raise your hand if in all of your work as an advisor you have never simply signed off on a set of course choices and waved the student goodbye and wished them a good day. Okay, just as I thought. Me too. But it was to be more than that. And then he says something pretty revolutionary right at the beginning of the second paragraph. The preceptor's basic function is teaching. 1970. Preceptor's basic function is teaching. Now, of course, then he says his constant goal is to show or make known. I don't know that most of us would define teaching as showing and making known, and actually we're going to come back to that too, because it has always, the notion of advising as teaching, which you see expressed here, also was just beginning to show up in the brand new advising literature at that time, which some of you are probably familiar with, especially in an article by Burns Crookston, which is listed in the bibliography on the back of the handout. But as to what teaching, if you're going to say that advising is teaching, you really need to say what kind of teaching it is. You need an account of teaching. And I don't know that showing and making known is the best account, although maybe in 4 words it's not bad. But he does go on to talk a little bit about what kind of teaching it is, and in the third, fourth, and fifth paragraphs, he says, okay, what is it that he teaches? And he mentions a few things. Advice about all aspects of college life, not just course selection. Information, in the 4th paragraph down, about what? About student services and who's responsible for them. Actually, at that time at Stockton, it turned out there were practically no student services because our first president believed that students were adults and should find their own services. Very interesting. And finally, at the bottom of the page and onto the next page, a judgmental role in the formulation of student programs. Students were to have free choice, but the preceptor was there to make judgments and say, wait a minute here. Where do you think you're going with that? Now, but more than anything else, and if you read the whole document, which I'm not going to walk you through right now, you'll see that there's considerable discussion about general studies. And the Stockton General Studies program at that time was completely revolutionary, and nobody knew how well it was going to work. West Tilley was pretty darn confident about it, more so than things warranted, in my opinion. But he believed that students coming straight out of high school were not going to do very well at making choices in it, and they needed help. Okay. It was almost at the same time, and there are others here who know more about this than I do, that advising was really getting geared up as a profession with an identity elsewhere. And the article by Crookston that I mentioned to you, which you can find on the back page, was really a very important step for a lot of people in helping to identify what advising was going to be about as a profession. because it was written mostly for people who were going to be advisors as a profession, not for university faculty, which is who Tilly was writing about, because there were no professional advisors at Stockton. All advising at Stockton, all the precepting was being done by faculty. Crookston wrote an article called, and I'm going to get the title wrong, so I'm going to make sure I've got it right. A developmental view of advising as teaching. Now, advising as teaching is mentioned again here. I happen to think that Crookston did not give a very good account of what teaching is, and I've written about that elsewhere, but I'm not going to dwell on it. But that's a common theme between these two writings. And Crookston had some other very, very good ideas that are not so different from Tilly's ideas. The most important one is that advising is not just to tell people what to do. And I think that both Tilly and Crookston were at pains to say that because they were living in an environment where, for the most part, advisors were telling people what to do. And of course, that's the easiest thing to do. Take this, you need it. It's the easiest, it's the simplest. If you've got 15-minute advising appointments, by golly, that's the way to be efficient. And everybody knew that. So the idea that advising was more than telling people what to take was really a growing idea at that time. Now, any field of endeavor is going to be defined more by people who do it full-time than by people who do it part-time. Faculty preceptors do advising part-time, and really probably in most cases a pretty pitifully small part-time, whereas people who are hired to be full-time advisors and do it day in, day out, think about it more, spend more time really reflecting on it. And so the definitions of advising and the theories of advising and about advising that came to the fore in the 1970s nationally were more creation of the full-time advisors who tended to be at large universities for the most part and were hired to be academic advisors. More so than from college and university faculty who are preceptors like Wes Tilley was talking about. I don't want to make this history be the long part of this because I really want to talk to you about a vision for what good advising can be. But I think it's important to have a sense of this duality between these two ways that people come to advising, because most of what you could read about advising in the 70s and 80s and well into the 90s was written by people who were full-time advisors, many of whom came from student affairs backgrounds, as perhaps some of you do, as I know some of you do, and saw advising in relation to other student affairs professions, more so than they saw it as being like and related to college teaching, which is how Tilley saw it. These two visions don't have to be at war with each other. They don't have to be radically different, but they are subtly different sometimes. And so there are people who do academic advising whose title is counselor because they come from places where advising is a student affairs function and it's assimilated to counseling as opposed to being assimilated to teaching. I used that terminology in an article for a journal and the editors took it out because they didn't think anybody would know what it meant. But by assimilated to, I mean pushed over to and seen as related to. Unfortunately, and some of you are familiar with the National Association, NACADA, there are two cultures within NACADA to some extent of people, of the full-time advisor culture. They call themselves professional advisors, unfortunately, as opposed to the amateur advisors who are faculty. That's why I don't like that terminology, and I refer to them as full-time advisors rather than professional advisors, because I believe that faculty get paid to do it too, so they're professionals. Anyway, there is sometimes some tension between those two groups of people within the association, and that's interesting. Now, I am unashamedly going to talk about a perspective on advising that I think assimilates it more to teaching, assimilates it to the work of college and university faculty more than it does to student affairs professionals and counselors. I don't see that as meaning that it has to be done only by faculty, because the description of advising that I'm going to talk about briefly, and that I've also written about, that vision of advising is perfectly appropriate to people who advise full-time, just as it is to people who advise part-time. I don't see that as being the important distinction. But it is academic advising with a capital A, and it is a kind of advising for which many, not all, college and university faculty are particularly well suited, and that's why it seems to me that it is particularly appropriate at a place like Stockton, where the vast majority of advising is done by faculty. But I want to, and I'll come back to this, and maybe we can talk about this later too. I believe that it's completely appropriate for so-called full-time advisors or professional advisors as well. I think there are advantages to seeing advising as a teaching and learning activity in the academic sense, assimilated to the work of faculty. It's going to be possible to talk about what students learn in advising, and that, in fact, is going to be my focus. What they learn in advising is closely connected to what they learn elsewhere in the curriculum, in their courses. It's a more natural role for faculty, and I think faculty may be the best people to do it, although not the only people who are superbly qualified to do it. And there's a vision emerging that a number of writers are expressing, and I've put some papers by people that I think are interesting on the list on the back page. Some of the intellectual features of this view of advising. One is the transition from a teaching-oriented perspective to a learning-oriented perspective. This is something that is going on nationally and not just in advising. In fact, this is a transition in thought that all colleges and universities ought to be engaged in, not just with respect to advising, or even particularly with respect to advising, but with respect to what goes on in their classrooms and other learning venues. That we focus less on the activities of the teacher and more on what's happening inside the brain of the student. That what matters is learning. What matters is not the performance, the style, the technique of the teacher. These things are all means to an end. The end is learning. So just as I'm here to talk to you about advising as teaching, and I've written about advising as teaching, some of my colleagues that I'm in correspondence with are saying you have to stop talking about teaching and talk about learning. And although I have to go back and rewrite all my papers, I think it's a good idea. The focus on learning means that we are outcomes oriented, which we, like it or not, are going to have to be. We don't want to evaluate what goes on in our classrooms based on the technique and style of our faculty. We want to evaluate what goes on in our classrooms based on what our students take away, what our students learn. So in the classroom, and by classroom I don't just mean physical rooms like this, I mean online situations, whatever modes may yet come along that we haven't even dreamed of yet, faculty offices where students may meet with professors one-on-one, whatever. The focus in the classroom needs to be on learning, not on instructor performance. This is beginning to be understood at our institutions. It is a long way from being understood in our state legislatures and such places where, and our statutes and regulations, where we still measure things in terms of contact hours, time that your tushy is in a seat, still how everybody measures everything, credit hours. These are things that are really all functioned on inputs. They're focused on inputs, they're not focused on outputs. We'll get there. So the transition from teaching to learning is one conceptual element in the new vision. The second one is Constructivism, which again is not just about advising, it's about education in general. The idea that the student is a constructor of knowledge, not a passive recipient. There's a lot of literature on constructivism, and I'm not an expert, but I am really taken with the idea that the thing that matters, the process that really matters, is the student bringing disparate elements together, making sense out of them, and that's where knowledge comes from. When I was in junior high school, I remember one of my fellow students saying to a teacher, for reasons that I can't remember, I think he was just basically sucking up, we're little sponges adrift on the sea of knowledge, soaking up its contents. It was strange from a 13-year-old to say something like that, and false. Because, although it may have been true then, which is pretty sad, but it's certainly not the vision of education that most of us have. Most of us now see students as active learners, by which we mean that they are constructing their learning, not receiving it. That's element 2. Element 1 was transition to a learning-oriented focus. Number 2 is constructivism. Number 3 is intentionality. Also a term that wasn't available to Tilly, but I hope it's one that you're hearing a lot. Intentionality means that decisions in educational settings are being made with educational goals consciously in mind, that how they address those goals is consciously in mind at all times. And if we were talking, for example, about a classroom setting, it is on the teacher's mind, and the teacher is explaining it and talking constantly. Teachers are always talking constantly, of course, speaking about how this material relates to that material, how this material addresses the overall goals of the course, how it fits in with what we talked about yesterday and what we're going to talk about tomorrow. Why are we talking about this today? Here's why. And the student on the other end, who is constructing his or her learning, not just receiving it, is putting things together in an intentional way as well. The instructor hopes that the student's model of the material at least somewhat approximates the instructor's model of the material. That may be more important in some material than others. Surya, it's very important for your material that the student understands what you're telling them in the same sort of way that you do. It may be less important in a philosophy class such as I used to teach. Maybe not. I just thought of that, and I don't think I want to pursue it too far. But the student is being intentional just as the instructor is being intentional. Now, how does this relate to advising? Well, let me start in this case with intentionality and the key point is perhaps a fairly obvious one, that we want students to make educational choices with educational goals constantly in mind. That is not a profound thought. It's one that we wish were actualized more often, of course, rather than choosing their classes based on what time of day they're offered. But there's more to it than just that, because there's a constructivist element as well, that it is the student's task to construct not just today's lesson in their chemistry class. It is the student's task to construct their education. And their education is not a curriculum worksheet. An education is not a CAP audit that says that you've fulfilled all the requirements. An education is an incredibly rich network of relationships between and among the various elements that can get checked off on a curriculum worksheet. Yes, took that. Yes, took that. Yes, got a C or better in that. It's much more than that. It is these relationships, and it's a series of relationships that the student actively, intentionally constructs among those elements. And the elements are not just courses. The elements may sometimes be groups of courses. Those of you who are not Stockton people may not be familiar with our liberal studies program. Our liberal studies program is a self-designed major, which many institutions have. And I had the pleasure of directing that program for several years, quite a while ago. And it was the most exciting academic advising that I ever had the opportunity to do. And I didn't fully realize why at the time until I started to have a vocabulary for talking about advising. But what was exciting about it was that way back in the 70s, when Wes Tilley invented that program, as he probably did, it was a place for intentionality and it was a place for constructivism. Because the student who wanted to self-design a major had to do more than say, I want to take these 32 courses. The student had to say, here are my educational goals. Here are some of the main ways in which I will reach those goals, i.e. groups of courses to reach those goals. Here's how they fit together. Here's how each of those groups of courses will contribute to meeting my educational goals. Here's how each of the individual courses within those groups will relate to the other courses in that group, how the groups relate to each other, how the groups relate to the goals. And a student who wanted to get into this program actually had to write a proposal in which that was all explained. Not a whole lot of students managed to do that. You'll be astonished to learn. But I had the fun of walking through that process with students who were having aha experiences right and left because they were understanding that an education could actually have a purpose, and that every element in it could have a purpose, and that it really could make sense, and that they could construct meaning for themselves, and it was great. It was years later that I came to understand, okay, so 1% of our students get to do that. No, all our students need to get to do that. They really do. All of our students need to get to do that. How can that be? They don't get to design their own education. They're not creative enough, maybe, or they're just not energetic enough, or we don't trust them to. But they can all have the experience of internally constructing meaning out of the intentionally gathered courses and groups of courses that are parts of their education, even if, in most cases, those courses were dictated to them by others who said, if you want to be a psychology major, you must take intro, you must take statistics, you must take experimental, you must take abnormal, and whatever else they're required to take, and so forth. A lot of those things are put in place by the faculty. There are rules. You don't have a choice. But even in the absence of choice, this is something that Tilly didn't see. Even in the absence of choice, you can still, with the help of a guide who's been there before and knows how to think about it, you can construct meaning for yourself out of the disparate pieces of your education. You can have maybe not quite as exciting an aha experience as a student constructing a liberal studies program, but you can have a very exciting experience where you start to make connections between and among the parts of your education, the individual courses, what you're taking this semester with what you're taking last semester, these two courses that you're taking both at the same time in different departments where neither professor is saying anything about the other because they've never even met each other. They're in different departments. But you can make connections. You can see, oh, wait, this department has a methods course and this department has a methods course. And the methods of study in these two disciplines are not the same, but they have some interesting similarities between them. Or we studied aggression in anthropology, and now I'm studying aggression in psychology, and I can see that they talk about it somewhat the same way, but at the same time also maybe not exactly the same way. Or how is interpreting a literary text similar to or different from a psychologist in abnormal psych trying to understand a mental illness? How are those things similar? How are they different? It can be tremendously exciting, and it ought to be tremendously exciting for students to have those experiences, to make those connections, to make meaning, to put those pieces together. Darn few students are going to come into college and take those courses and do that on their own. It's not going to happen. But with a coach, it could happen. With somebody who's been there before and has had those experiences for himself or herself, who maybe sees it coming in some cases, I think it would really benefit you if you take that course, that sociology course and that philosophy course in the same semester next year. I think you're going to like it, and we'll talk about why when the time comes. That an advisor, even in a curriculum with very little choice, even in a curriculum with lots and lots of rules and regulations where students don't create their own majors, an advisor can coach the student with Socratic questioning and a whole armament of techniques to put those pieces together in maybe the same ways that the advisor would like to put them together, maybe not, maybe in whole different ways, but the ways that are meaningful for the student, and make meaning out of it. In other words, make an education out of it. This is a task that I see students working on from the time that they start through, and it's the linear dimension of it is very interesting too, the chronological dimension, because courses refer back to other courses, courses refer forward to other courses, and part of what that means is that what you learned in a course last semester, you are still learning because you're still making meaning out of that material as you study new material this semester that changes your perspective on what you studied last semester. This is part of how I see, I hate to use words like this, an ideal student's educational experience. That that the learning doesn't end when a course ends, that it continues as new ideas, new perspectives, new methods of thought, new ways of knowing enter the armament and provide opportunities to rethink what you learned last semester and, by golly, relearn it. And I see the advisor as the person who can coach a student through this process. Coach may not be the perfect verb, but it's not bad. Now, this means that the advisor is really playing a tremendous role in the student's learning experiences. It means that the advisor is, figuratively speaking, right there with the student when the student is in the classroom or back in the dorm room reading a book or sitting at the computer typing a paper, that the advisor is right there with them, helping them think things through, not literally in this case, but has taught them some skills for making those linkages and connections. It also means that the advising relationship itself is a locus of learning, because in that relationship, the way I picture it, the student is talking with the advisor about the construction of meaning, about the construction of learning that's going on, and that he or she is doing, and is having those aha experiences right then and there, because the advisor is asking, okay, remember I said it would be a good idea to take that philosophy course on American pragmatism in the same semester that you took, that you would take this sociology course, and now let's talk about why that turned out to be a good idea. And the student can see perhaps that the influence of philosophy of pragmatism on American society, which didn't actually get emphasized in the sociology course, is nonetheless a key factor in why Americans think the way they do, and wouldn't have had that thought if she hadn't taken both of those courses, and maybe especially wouldn't have had that thought if she hadn't taken them both at the same time. So I'm imagining that advising is an aid to learning in two ways. First, that it gives a student the skills and the disposition to construct learning between and across courses and areas of the curriculum, and second, because in the advising relationship itself, right there in the office or the email or whatever winds up replacing those, and fortunately I won't be around to see it, right there in that interaction, in that dyad, learning takes place too. And that's why advising, I think, can be, should be, must be learning-centered. I mentioned earlier that college and university faculty are particularly well suited to do this type of work. And I said, I meant to say, not all of them perhaps. Because people who are going to be good at this are going to be people who have done some of the same kind of thinking themselves. Sadly, I bet that most of our PhD programs at our major research universities do not focus their students on developing these habits of thought or developing the skills or even, quite frankly, thinking much about anything other than the discipline they're getting their PhD in. Certainly that was true in mine. In my PhD program, I certainly wasn't taught to teach, and I also certainly wasn't taught to relate my own discipline to other disciplines, with certain narrow exceptions. I learned much more of that in my undergraduate education, frankly, and in the work that I've done in thinking about advising and writing about advising, I've probably drawn on my undergraduate education more than I did on my graduate education. But the larger point, and I'm rambling a little bit here, the larger point is that some faculty who've been well educated and who have had the opportunity to think about how academic disciplines relate to each other are going to be very good at this. Some faculty who are very narrowly educated and have really only thought about one discipline in a long time are not likely to be as good at it. And although, frankly, I think that those faculty are not likely to be as good teachers either. Because the flip side of this, advising as teaching, I also believe in teaching as advising. I think that classroom instruction ought to include calling attention to the kinds of linkages that a really good advisor will help students find. And that in teaching your discipline, you really ought to be making connections to other disciplines as well. So I think that faculty, and I believe that that ought to be an important part of teaching. That doesn't mean that anybody who doesn't do that is a terrible teacher. I'm not quite willing to go that far yet. Maybe the day before I retire, I'll give a speech in which I say that. I do think, actually I lost my train there for a second, that advisors, faculty who are going to be good, who are qualified to be good advisors in the way I've been talking about, have a leg up as classroom teachers as well. I'd go that far. I'm tempted to make a stronger claim, but anyway. Now, what about full-time advisors, or as they are unfortunately sometimes called professional advisors? I don't see any reason why they can't do this kind of advising too. Now, I think that a lot of the graduate programs that folks are going to that prepare them for their advising careers are not structured to do that. But they could be. Neither are the graduate programs that the faculty go to, as I just said. Nobody is really being intentionally prepared to do this kind of advising. Luckily enough, there are some people around who seem to be good at it and seem to be interested in encouraging others to be good at it. And I find that exciting and encouraging, but I think that in the education of advisors, whether they are faculty advisors or full-time advisors, we would be very well served if we put more of an emphasis on the skills and knowledge that are needed to do the kind of advising that I'm talking about. And those skills and knowledge require, I think, some breadth of disciplinary knowledge, not just a narrow specialization, but really an appreciation of how academic disciplines are related to each other, which you might call the topography of the world of learning and knowledge. And very few people currently are being trained to have that, but I think that would be a really critical element for somebody who's going to be a really fine advisor. And it could be done. It could be done. It could be done in graduate programs to train full-time advisors. It could also be done in graduate programs that PhD scholars come out of, and those people would be darn better teachers than most of the people who came out of my PhD program probably were. Certainly better teacher than I was at the start, because I would have been better at talking to my students where they are and helping them see why what I was teaching them was relevant to their other interests. I would have been so much better teacher. So I would really like to see both what are typically master's programs, although maybe not in some cases doctoral programs as well, that the full-time advisors are coming out of, and the PhD and other doctoral programs that college faculty are coming out of. I'd like to see both of those kinds of programs, preparing people to do this kind of advising by helping them to develop the breadth of perspective and the skills. And the skills are tricky. I don't claim to have those skills, by the way. And if you were to consult with Dr. Hagen and ask him, or Paula, whoever it is that has the information, how many preceptees does Lowenstein actually have? The answer is 0, because no sane student would come anywhere near me. I don't claim that I actually have the skills, unless they want to be in liberal studies. But I do think that I know that I've got an idea about what a really good advisor would be like.